Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're just giving you a couple of seconds there for our start at 6 o'clock. My name is Gabriel, Assis, Director of Soccer Operations with BC Soccer.
Hi, everyone. You've probably heard from me leading up to this webinar. My name is Celia Heaney. I am the Senior Coordinator of Membership Engagement at BC Soccer.
I'll introduce myself before turning over to Gabe. My name is Samantha Heron. I go by the pronouns she and her, and I represent ITP Sport. So I'll be joining in later today for the second half of the presentation.
Welcome to the webinar series for BC Soccer Member Organizations 2023. We're excited to have you tonight. We'll talk about the BC Soccer Judicial System in our first webinar, with two more webinars to come later this year over the next 2 months. Our goal tonight is to give an overview of the BC Soccer Judicial System, explain some of the processes and some of the enhancements done to the system over the last few months, and also provide any clarity as you may have either across your league, your district, or your club in general. First, I wanted to acknowledge and provide thanks to our work and of our members that takes place on the unceded territories of the First Nations people across this province, across BC, and really thank today Samantha and Saleh for helping us on setting up the webinar. Our main two main goals for the first part of this presentation is explanation around the judicial system and a clear understanding and discussion around the jurisdiction of complaints, discipline, and appeals that are submitted to BC Soccer judicial bodies. And we'll start with the judicial system. Over the last 12 months, BC Soccer conducted an extensive review of the judicial code and policies, which was the governing documentation for the judicial system in British Columbia. That also included consulting with external experts in the area of safe sport, conflict resolution, as well as legal. And we've updated our policies and procedures on all judicial matters. The update of the policy and the procedures was the initial stage or phase 2 for BC Soccer's discipline complaints and appeals process, which then began to be managed independently from BC Soccer staff and board. And a third-party ITP Sport was then brought to manage and triage all the complaints, discipline, and appeals matters related within the judicial bodies of BC Soccer. The introduction of two very comprehensive documents, the Discipline Complaints and Appeals Policy, as well as the Discipline and Complaints and Appeals Procedures, basically establish and describe the disciplinary process for BC Soccer in alignment with FIFA laws of the game, the Universal Code of Conduct, BC Soccer rules and regulations, as well as any regulations governing safe sport and the management of complaints for the sports sector. Those two documents provide more clarity, give guidance to the participants and stakeholders around the intake, the management, and the resolution of all discipline complaints and appeals managed by our judicial bodies. The implementation of this process was an important step for us, particularly around creating a more transparent and more independent and efficient judicial system in line with the developments across the sports system in BC. This includes the adoption of the BC Universal Code of Conduct. The BC UCC, as is described, sets the standards for acceptable behavior by all participants in all sport organizations across the province and established common definitions of responsibility and prohibited behaviors for participants. All safe sport initiatives and new developments will continue to be reviewed by BC Soccer and incorporated to ensure progress in alignment with the different. At the forefront of what we're doing is our effort to keep all our participants safe while enjoying positive soccer experiences. Over the next slides, I'm going to outline the key elements added to the system and the structure that we now have in place for judicial system across BC. We'll start with the necessity on identifying or properly identifying the different type of complaints that there are managed by judicial bodies within the BC Soccer structure. In identifying the complaints received historically received by BC Soccer, we look at three major areas that we needed to focus on. We identified Tier 1 as being complaints related to the breaches of the BC Universal Code of Conduct, Tier 2 as it relates to dispute, and Tier 3 as it relates to match-related incidents being the lower level in terms of complexity and the severity of associated misconduct, and the Tier 1 obviously being the ones that are more complex and the ones that require further investigation by the system. In review also of the complaints, that dictates that a better structure needed to be put in place in order to properly address the complaint process and the discipline process occurring from. And that includes a few elements that I'm going to highlight for you tonight. Number one was establishing an independent third-party officer, an ITP officer, that was able to properly triage and manage all the different complaints and the intake of the complaints coming into the BC Soccer judicial body. I want to reaffirm and remind judicial body being those bodies of decision-making that occur independently of BC Soccer board and staff, independently of the organization, but in line with the policies and procedures set by the governing body. In this case, BC Soccer. And then we established two bodies responsible for independently responsible for their areas of take related to complaints. One is the disciplinary body, looking specifically at the intake of discipline and complaints. And that particular body is also comprised of three different chambers. The chambers being decided or being established in order to adjudicate and decide over the different type of complaints that could potentially be received by a judicial body of BC Soccer. The number one, the Tier 1 chamber is the ethics chamber, is the one responsible, if we go back to the slide before, the one responsible for Tier 1 complaints. Complaints that have been identified by the ITP officer as breaching the Universal Code of Conduct, and therefore requiring a more comprehensive review as it relates to that specific code and the processes outlined within the BC Soccer discipline complaints and appeals procedures. The ethics chamber can be comprised of between 1 and 3 panel members, an arbitrator at times, and they oversee the process once a Tier 1 is identified. Below that chamber is the dispute resolution chamber, a chamber that is responsible for complaints related to Tier 1, related to dispute resolutions that do not breach the UCC, but are still required to be reviewed by BC Soccer judicial body and come into the Tier 2 chamber. And a match incident chamber, which is deciding over Tier 2 complaints. So those are match-related incidents that are presided over or adjudicated by the disciplinary chair. So in the past, the position of judicial chair was one executed and established within the rules of BC Soccer. The enhancement within these new policies, the new policy and the procedures, created the role of the disciplinary chair, which is the one deciding over match-related incidents. Those match-related incidents, however, have a limited scope as it relates to the jurisdiction of BC Soccer, which I'll address in the next little while. But in composition of the disciplinary body, those are the three chambers responsible to adjudicate over complaints and discipline received by BC Soccer. And a separate and completely independent body is the appeals body. That appeals body also divided into three chambers, the ethics chamber for decisions from the disciplinary body related to Tier 1 that could be appealed to an appeals body over that case. Same thing for Tier 2 and same thing for Tier 3. Match match-related incidents that are appealed to BC Soccer under the proper grounds and jurisdiction, which we'll address in the next slide, would come to the specific chamber and then be dealt in accordance to the procedures. Similar to the disciplinary body, there is an appointed appeals chair for the Tier 3 chamber, and that individual is the one responsible for adjudicating over those complaints, or sorry, those appeals referred to by the ITP officer into the match incident chamber. Then we look at the concept and the clarification around jurisdiction, which is very important, particularly around determining responsibility and determining the levels within the game that require scrutiny or that require resources to adjudicate over cases. Within the procedures and within the spirit of the policy and how it was designed, the jurisdiction is very well established. Number one being with BC Soccer responsible for the items that you see on the slide. Number one, all the different breaches to the UCC are to be escalated directly to BC Soccer in a way that allows BC Soccer, in the case to BC Soccer judicial body, in ways that allow the judicial body to carry on with the appropriate investigation and with the appropriate processes outlined within the procedures to come to an outcome and really identify the breach if so occurred. Other complaints related to that is referred to BC Soccer by other provincial associations, as well as misconduct by association officials and within members and affiliated, as well as misconduct at BC Soccer provincial competitions. And this is really a point that is important for us to clarify, that the jurisdiction of BC Soccer when it comes to match related relates to provincial competitions, or those competitions that are directly operated and managed by BC Soccer, League One BC, BCSPL, and the provincial championships. Those are the ones where the jurisdiction of BC Soccer applies and where the misconduct at those events become part of the process for a Tier 3 complaint of submitted to the disciplinary body. There is still language within the procedure that allows a judicial body of BC Soccer to handle cases at their own discretion, and those cases happen from time to time, either by decision on how it's being handled currently by the organization, or for inability of that organization to properly handle the case in accordance with the procedure. Member organizations, in this case, we're talking about youth districts or adult leagues. They handle all the discipline that involves their own members, which could be clubs or teams or participants, and that does not exceed the threshold above. So as long as it is within the jurisdiction of the member organization should be capable and it's empowered by the policies and the procedures to make decisions within their own members. Similar to that, a clarification was provided within the procedures to look at what level of appeal or what appeals could be then heard by BC Soccer, which is a continuation of the old judicial policies and code, or judicial code at the time, but clarifying that appeals to BC Soccer are related to decisions made by a youth district or adult league, an inter-district youth league, a BC Soccer Standing Committee, which in the case of BC Soccer, there are currently 3 committees that are part of that structure. So that's the Nominations Committee, the Governance and Membership Committee, the Finance, Audit, and Risk Committee, and a BC Soccer disciplinary body. So decisions from disciplinary body could then be appealed to the appeals body, which operates independently, and the ITP officer would provide the proper communication between the two bodies to ensure that level of independence remains in place. One of the components of related to discipline and jurisdiction that it's always a question and requires clarification on, it relates to match-related discipline. So back in November, as well as a reminder was issued earlier in 2023, clarification around the match-related discipline and who's responsible to manage that initial intake of that discipline. The issue of jurisdiction, or the clarification around jurisdiction, exists within the system to provide the avenue, or the correct avenue, for the different members and to BC Soccer to properly adjudicate over cases. Instead of simply funneling all the different complaints and discipline matters into one organization, the jurisdiction allows for members to deal with matters related to their members at their level, and then BC Soccer providing the other layer of oversight, either through the appeal mechanism that exists or through consulting and support the member on their decisions. And match-related discipline is very common within submissions to BC Soccer judicial bodies from a standpoint of not comprehending the scrutiny and the necessary steps needed to be taken by member organizations in the first place. We conducted a review of the system that managed the match-related system. So that was the CRM that was hosting all the discipline reports submitted by referees, and conducted a few stakeholder engagements around the use of that system and how it could better be utilized within for the future. So we included a clear now direction that exists for referees, where the referee has the ability to utilize some of the BC Soccer or the BC Soccer match-related discipline reports available on our website, make the proper completion of the document, and then submit that information to the appropriate jurisdiction, let it be an adult league or youth league or a club, depending on the level of competition in place. The league then has the ability to identify and contact the person to review the match-related discipline report. And that is an important step within this process, is comprehending that, or understanding that the competition has the ability to bring evidence or gather information that, if necessary, can be escalated, but not escalated at without the proper step in the proper first review. And once completing and identifying clearly if there is further necessity to escalate the match related discipline, that can be done so in a proper way through our independent channel, through the judicial body of BC Soccer, in a way that can then be dealt at the appropriate level. And that's where it opens the process and starts the process for communication between the judicial body and the appropriate member organizations. So as a result of the modified forms now available on the website, effective July 31st of 2023, the CRM discipline management system will be retired, and then match officials can utilize their own their related discipline reports available on the website and provide them to the appropriate competition in the league that they work with. Most of the leagues already have their own competition management system that they can continue to use so to record match-related discipline. We're talking about accumulation of cards and red cards, as well as anything that is match-related, and that information can still be managed as per the jurisdiction within the appropriate competition. If identified that any of the reports received by a competition exceeds the threshold like we described in the jurisdiction and should be handled by a BC Soccer judicial body, the league will then refer that case to the independent third party, to the judicial body, through the integrated counts confidential report that can then be taken by the ITP officer, and the process can take place from there. And that's where I invite now Samantha, Heron to then present on the steps taken in all the different continuation of this process via ITP.
Thanks, Gabe. I'm going to load my screen and then I'll begin presenting. Confirming that you see the screen. Great, thanks, Gabe. Hi, everyone. As mentioned at the beginning of the call, my name is Samantha Heron. I go by the pronouns she and her, and one of my roles is the Complaint and Conflict Management Consultant for ITP Sport. ITP Sport and Recreation is considered an independent body that, while administering complaint management services for sport and recreation partners and clients across the country, also does work in safe sport education, conflict management, and supporting organizations in adopting the appropriate policies and procedures as we transition through an always changing safe sport landscape. I think what's really important before I go into the specifics of the BC Soccer complaint management process is to acknowledge that there is a lot of changing information in the safe sport context. I'm very aware of all information that people access, whether it's news or within your specific sports space. And outside of a complaint management process, I always welcome and I'm happy to have conversations around the general safe sport system because we're all in positions to make recommendations to support it getting better. Specific to BC Soccer, our role here is to, as Gabriel outlined, administer a complaint management process. And I'm going to walk through the process that we work through, as well as on this first slide today, the team members that you may interact with if you or any parties that you work with are engaged in a complaint management system. One thing to also acknowledge is we really support the principles of alternative dispute resolution. The complaint management process here is seen to be when you think about the spectrum of alternative dispute resolution, it's quite far to what I would consider the right, whereas the left side is around principles that result in win-win outcomes for different parties and allow the parties to work through conflict and concerns before escalating to a complaint management process. That being said, wherever appropriate and wherever you feel the need, it's always encouraged to file a complaint and have the opportunity to talk to a case manager or a representative from ITP about the complaint management process. And so when we think about your interactions with BC Soccer, the team that we have is administrative support, case managers, and dispute resolution specialists. I oversee a lot of the case managers as well as our admin team that supports the complaint management process. In the administrative team, you're going to see complaint triage. And so this is where when a complaint gets filed, it gets reviewed first for jurisdiction and then for if the material in the complaint meets the threshold for the alleged behavior to be processed through one of the respective tiers. The other piece here with the administrative team is they support the Tier 3 discipline chair in administering the Tier 3 process. And so what that means is we receive the complaints and we would tier it appropriately, share it with the Tier 3 discipline panel chair, and then support them through the administrative aspects and necessary follow-up around the Tier 3 related complaint. The other individuals that you may work with are case managers, and case managers support complaint triage as well as administer a Tier 1 and Tier 2 process. The complaint manager provides information support. They also make decision on, dependent on the information available to them, where a complaint should be directed, so Tier 1 or Tier 2. And they will work with the parties to ensure that the parties have the necessary information to work through the process. Case managers are considered neutral, and case managers, beyond the initial decision-making of where to process a complaint, don't typically have decision-making on the final outcome, as that is left to an arbitrator, panel, or dispute resolution specialist. And that leads to the last person that you may interact with in a complaint management process, the DRS. And the dispute resolution specialist is an individual who either works in investigations or an individual who works in alternative dispute resolution. So a really good example is I work as a mediator, and in some cases where it's appropriate to have the complaint processed through alternative dispute resolution, potentially before being escalated through a more formal complaint process, we would support the parties in those spaces for complaints that are not related to the Universal Code of Conduct. We'll then move to the next slide, and this is a Tier 1 complaint. A Tier 1 complaint is considered an incredibly severe and serious complaint, and a Tier 1 complaint is a complaint where the alleged behavior breaches the BC Universal Code of Conduct. The BC Universal Code of Conduct, if you're familiar with the Universal Code to prevent and address maltreatment in sport, outlines the standards and expectations for parties in regard to harassment, discrimination, bullying, neglect, and a multitude of other behaviors related to power dynamics or any sort of racist, homophobic behavior that is often experienced in sports spaces. The UCC establishes common definitions and expectations in which parties should be in which parties should adhere to, and any violation of the UCC or alleged violation of the UCC will first be triaged through a Tier 1 disciplinary process. And what that means is that on review of the complaint, the respondent is contacted and the respondent is required or requested to provide a response to the allegations, at which point in time all materials will be reviewed. And from there, the complaint will go through a number of recommendations. And if it continues through the Tier 1 process, the complaint and the response will be heard by an arbitrator or a panel. Oftentimes, the panel consists of one arbitrator, but at times, dependent on the complaint and the complexity of it, the panel will consist of up to 3 members. The arbitrators are typically individuals with an experience in the sports system, that they are also certified as arbitrators in our general legal and litigious systems. I do want to make it very clear here, and as noted on the slide, a Tier 1 process is not a substitute for a criminal or civil process. And so what that means is even though the complaint may be being heard by an arbitrator, it doesn't mean that it will substitute any sort of sanctions or expectations that an individual would have in going through a criminal or civil process. And so it's really important that if you've experienced behavior that needs to go through those necessary systems, that it's reported in those spaces. And we can always support you in doing that. And the general principle is that the Tier 1 disciplinary process would be held in abeyance until that criminal or civil process is completed. The sanctions that we can provide and the outcomes that we can provide are, once again, not the same as a criminal or civil process. And so therefore, it's really important to understand why you want to engage in the different systems. The next type of complaint is a Tier 2 complaint. And a Tier 2 complaint is any behavior that is not considered, if found to be true, a violation of the Universal Code of Conduct, but it otherwise violates or comes into conflict with the BC soccer policies, specifically in regard to safe sport and expectations for the members. Once again, these complaints are first looked at for jurisdiction and then looked at for if they meet a threshold that breaches the policies. However, typically in this space, there's a significant amount of latitude to the dispute resolution specialist to determine how the complaint and how the respondent will engage in the process. We really don't want this space to be a punitive space. And generally in working through this, it's trying to allow the parties to come to a mutually beneficial outcome where appropriate, and implement sanctions that reflect improving best practice across the discipline and complaint system. We can always also refer complaints either up to a tier 1 process or dismiss complaints dependent on what an investigation finds. And we often try to engage and be as collaborative as possible with the parties, especially the complainant, on how this process will work. The last type of complaint, as referenced, is a tier 3 related complaint. In the tier 3 space, as mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, we provide administration support to the tier 3 discipline chair. I'll note that I'm very, very grateful for the panel members who engage in the tier 3 space because they give up a significant amount of their time, and they're BC Soccer members who I'm sure you're aware of if you're not a panel member yourself, who are working within their own respective leagues and districts. And so the work that the panel members do to administer a match-related complaints and discipline policy is appreciated here. And in the tier 3 complaints, the complaint is first reviewed by the discipline chair to make a determination on a number of recommendations for how the complaint is processed, whether that goes to a hearing, whether written submissions are considered and a decision is issued, or whether the complaint is referred or dismissed because on review of the material, the tier 3 discipline chair does not feel it's appropriate to pursue the complaint at this level. An important note here is that a complaint may involve multiple respondents, and the behavior of each respective respondent may actually be directed to different tiers within the system. And at the same time, and I know it can feel a little bit complex, depending on who submits a complaint, if the individual who submits a complaint is not necessarily the person who was subject to the behavior, and so a really good example is a league administrator submitting a complaint on behalf of an individual within their respective membership, we may go through a process where we also involve co-complainants to ensure that the appropriate parties are informed of the process and can be made aware of ways to engage in the process. Oftentimes, the principle is that the outcomes of the tier 1 process would impose similar sanctions, and we would expect that the tier 3 process would uphold or respect any decisions that are issued in the tier 1 process. There is a little bit of that hierarchy there, and generally there's also an expectation that in lieu of or on top of sanctions that are assigned in the tier 1 process, that the appropriate tier 3 sanctions would also be considered by the panel. So I'll next touch on the complaint process and what to expect. And so complaints are submitted through the integrity count system, which I'll touch on in a later slide. And in this space, it's where a team member from ITP will review the complaint and make a couple of determinations. Either the complaint will be admitted to a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 process and go through the information gathering or request for a response from the respondent. There are times where we will ask the complainant to provide more information in order for us to make a decision about where the complaint goes and or if the complaint is admissible or inadmissible. Following there, if the complaint continues through the process, it will then be heard by the panel or dispute resolution specialist. And the panel, when you look at this third stage here, could either be a tier 1 panel or a tier 3 panel. In that process, The parties may go through a series of written submissions, oral hearings, or a combination of both, dependent on what is required by the panel or dispute resolution specialist. Always we encourage the parties to reach out and ask questions if they're unsure about the process, and that can be around representation, that can be around having support people, that can be around accessibility of the hearings, or just general questions about the process that they're engaging in. It's really important to us that the parties feel comfortable asking questions and feeling informed about the process. Lastly, a finding and decision will be issued. And when you look at the finding and decisions issued, the parties will be notified. Typically, it's for the Tier 3 related complaints, we're very confident in how the respondent is notified. Depending on how the complaint is filed, we also work through our communications with the leagues and districts to ensure that any other parties should be made aware of the decision. And then obviously appeals are also heard through the integrity count system. Dependent on the decision being appealed, the appeal will either be heard by an appeals panel for a Tier 1 or Tier 2 process, and that is once again an independent arbitrator that is brought in. For a Tier 3 related appeal, we have our appeals panel chair who will hear matters related to any Tier 3 decisions, and that person has a really good understanding of the BC soccer system. In what to expect on the complaint process, the processes, as alluded to, vary dependent on the tier, as well as dependent on what the decision maker feels is the appropriate process to get to the resolution or desired outcome of the complaint. And so oftentimes I would say that a complaint goes through a review of all of the submissions and then to an oral hearing. However, we have seen internal investigations, third-party investigations for really severe and complex complaints, opportunities to engage in alternative dispute resolution ahead of going through a process, and or any other item that especially the dispute resolution specialist or the panel feels is required to gain an understanding of what occurred and issue a decision. We attempt to do the initial triage, especially when all the information is available to us, within 3 to 4 days at maximum of receiving a complaint. The timelines beyond the initial triage, and that can also vary dependent on what information is available to us, then become at the discretion of the disciplinary panel or the dispute resolution specialist. And as mentioned here, the complaint timelines are often impacted by, at onset, being able to contact the respondent and notify them of the appropriate window to acknowledge and respond to the complaint. If there is any additional information required in order to understand where the complaint is triaged or how it should be processed, as well as items like impending competitions and events, or any other items that require a panel to look at a complaint and make a decision in a time-sensitive manner. I do note here that the urgency around Tier 3 complaints is understood, and we do understand that, especially as it comes into a tournament, and forgive me because I'm not a savvy person on soccer, but the tournament and championship season, we would want to make sure that, especially in that appeal space, we are in a position to hear and process those appeals as efficiently as possible, while still ensuring that the due process and available information is available to all of the parties as they work through it. And then I'll touch on filing and communication and what to expect. And so complaints are filed through a system called Integrity Counts. Integrity Counts is it's essentially a web platform that documents all of the complaints for the clients that ITP Sport has. And in the Integrity Counts submission, first of all, the way that you submit the complaint is private and confidential to ITP Sport. And so there's a degree of independence between ITP and BC Soccer in reviewing that complaint. So, for example, I'm the individual who was privy to the complaints coming in through integrity counts, or another one of our team members. And that allows us to work with complainants, especially if they want to remain anonymous, or especially if they have inquiries about the process and they want to keep it confidential until they're feeling confident about the next step they would like to engage in. We will communicate with the complainants through integrity counts. We acknowledge that you can upload attachments, whether it's written, video, pictures of what occurred, through integrity counts. One really important thing to note is that the respondents will not be contacted through integrity counts, but instead via email. And we typically use SharePoint as a document storage space, and we typically share materials related to a complaint through SharePoint, which is a Microsoft Office tool or a Microsoft Office platform. Obviously, it's really important to note at any time in a complaint process, accessibility needs in regard to accessing the materials or to connect, or sorry, for connecting with an ITP officer or case manager. Through integrity counts and after processing complaints through here, we will then communicate with the leagues and/or districts and BC Soccer when issuing decisions or acquiring information. One of the pieces that I would acknowledge here is that in working with BC Soccer compared to other sport organizations, there's a real interconnectedness between the clubs, the districts and the leagues, and the provincial sport organization, and a lot of the communications and decision-making impact the various levels. And so as a team at ITP, we're building out our knowledge and what that communication looks like, and are definitely reviewing right now who needs to be communicated with and how we work through the appropriate platform to make sure that we are in contact with the right parties and are able to get the right information as we process complaints. The last slide that I have here is to support complaint management and to support efficient processing is, where possible, provide as much detail and material in your submissions at the onset of filing a complaint. That allows us to then triage a complaint in a rather efficient manner and then move it forward to the next step. As always, you can consult around what information you would like to include. We will never provide advice, and we will never provide any sort of legal opinion or opinion on what you should do to formulate a complaint. However, we can support you, especially if you have questions around, as mentioned earlier, confidentiality, anonymity, and a way to ensure that those pieces are preserved as you go through a process. One of the other pieces is, at times we do receive referee reports that come through integrity counts, and we have worked with parties where they understand that behavior that they may have experienced would have been documented in a referee report. It is recommended that if you feel that you have experienced behavior that needs to be addressed through the BC Soccer complaints and discipline process, to file a complaint, because that allows us to engage you fully as a complainant and ensure that we have a comprehensive view of what you feel occurred and of any submissions that you may have to the process, because we are likely not able to access that through a referee. Where the incident and the complainant are linked together, that's where we can support connecting the referee report to the complaint. And at that point in time, it becomes a hugely valuable document to be reviewed by, especially in Tier 3 related senses, the Tier 3 discipline panel. And then also I say here, where possible, provide contact information, especially if you're providing a complaint or if you are filing a complaint that involves a minor. We really want to be able to get in touch with the legal guardians and representatives. We also really value receiving the contact information for a respondent in a complaint, because that allows us to reach out to them relatively quickly, even though I know BC Soccer is always really patient with our inquiries for further information. And then, as always, we really encourage individuals to reach out around the complaint management process, whether you're a complainant, whether you're a league or district representative, or somebody else who wants to learn more about the process. I'm always happy to talk through that where appropriate.
Thanks, Sam. I want to thank Sam Slay for helping us facilitate the webinar tonight, and I want to thank you all the members and affiliated groups that joined us tonight. This is definitely an area that continue to evolve. We continue to strive to be leaders in this space, primarily with the focus on continue to provide a safe environment to all participants. Over the next 2 months, as I said at the start, we'll continue to have webinar series in different topics. The next one in the month of April around club licensing, particularly on the imminent requirement of quality soccer provider by September of 2023 for our organizations across BC. We'll have some guests talking about the process of club license, as well as some supporting mechanisms that have been put in place. So for now, thanks everyone. Good night, and thanks Sam and Saleh.